Hello! We're sorry that you could not be with us today. We hope you are feeling better. But here we are. We're going to read from Fever 1793 for you so you don't miss anything while you are at home. Are we ready, class?
Yeah.
Everyone's ready. They are featured off camera for privacy purposes. So, since I'm 6 feet away, the mask is coming down. I'm going to read over the dishwasher and the washing machine that we have going. If you remember, we are on chapter 15. I know you don't have your book at home with you right now, so I'm going to read aloud to you. Are you ready to begin? So somebody tell me, page 105, what happened in the last chapter? Anybody remember?
Her grandpa was sick and then he got all better.
Right, Grandpa was sick, but now he's better. Somebody else is not feeling good right now, Jeanette. Who is sick? The girl. What's her name? Matilda. Matilda, but sometimes we call her Maddie for short. Okay? So, she's worried though. She's just woken up, and she's in a hospital and she's being cared for. And grandfather has come to check on her. And there's a woman named Miss Flagg who grandpa kind of is flirting with, right? I mean, come on, grandpa. Really? And Matilda wakes up, and who is she worried about? She's worried about her mother. Okay, because her mom was sick with what? Yellow fever. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got this set up and ready to go real quick. Sorry. I blocked myself. I don't like a big close-up of my face on here. I can't do it without... Okay. I'm going to make this so that the screen stays with me. And here we go. Okay, sorry for that close-up. Okay, here we go. Chapter 15. This is now September 22nd, 1793. For long days and nights, stories flew over my head as I slept in my narrow bed at Bush Hill. Bush Hill is where the hospital is. Thank you, sir. Nurses and doctors, weeping relatives, and volunteers from the Free African Society whispered their sorrows. They echoed around the beautiful hall with the glittering chandelier. They told of a small child found huddled around the body of her dead mother. As volunteers placed the mother in a coffin, page 106, the child cried out, "Why are you putting Mama in a box?" They had to turn the child over to a neighbor and take the mother away for burial. Okay, this is a very sad way to open up this chapter, but we're talking about an epidemic that occurred a few hundred years ago, right? So it's not a pleasant topic, but we're in it. They told of the dying man who pulled himself to the window of his bedchamber and begged people to bring him a drink of water. Many passed by, hurrying away from the sound of his voice, until a brave soul entered the house to help him. They told of thieves who crept in and stole jewelry off the dead and dying. They told of good people who refused to take any money for helping strangers, even though they themselves were poor and near destitute. They told of the mighty who had fallen ill, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton and Dr. Rush himself. Both had recovered, though. Dr. Rush's sister had died. Hamilton had fled the city. They told of terror, patients who had tried to jump out of windows when the fever robbed their reason, screams that pierced the night, people who were buried alive, parents praying to die after burying all their children. Sorry, guys. This is a heavy chapter. I laid my pillow over my head to protect myself from visions of the dead, but I could not breathe. No one told stories of the painter's assistant named Nathaniel or a cook named Eliza. No one told of my mother. A breeze stirred through the open window, and the crystals of the chandelier struck a gentle chord. The voices faded. On the 10th morning I was visited by a French doctor, Dr. Devise. He did not carry a lancet or bowl. He seemed most concerned with the color of my eyes and tongue and the temper of my pulse. He grunted with satisfaction. She will live, Dr. Devise said. He turned to Mrs. Flagg. She stays here one more night, then move her to the barn. You have the hunger? He asked me. I answered, yes, I'm famished. Feed this girl, he said with a smile. It's good to see a patient who eats. He patted my hand and moved on. So is this a good sign for Matilda? Yes, much better than those stories she was just telling. Excuse me, please, I called after him. What would happen to me? Did we have to walk to Gwynedd? How could we get home? My voice was too weak to carry far, and the doctor was already concentrating on the next jaundiced face. What's the trouble, love? Miss Flagg asked as she brought a dinner tray. As I poured out my concerns to her, she tucked a napkin under my chin. Too many questions. You'll make yourself sick again. There is only one thing that you need to worry about, and that is finishing this here meal. You won't be leaving here for a few days at least. You can't solve tomorrow's problems today, but you can put some meat on those skinny bones. I nodded and dug into my supper. It didn't take long to finish the small portion of mutton and bread. Page 108. When it was gone, Mrs. Flagg handed me a bowl of rice and boiled prunes. It's got a wee bit of sugar on it, she whispered. Young ladies need something sweet. And when you're done with that, you'll have a good wash and move to your new bed over in the barn. The barn wasn't at all what I imagined. The faint smell of manure was everywhere, but the walls were whitewashed and the dirt floor swept clean. So is this like a barn where a bunch of animals would sleep? Maybe it used to be, but it sounds like they've cleaned it up a lot so that people can stay there. Okay, so they said that the walls were clean and white and that the floor was swept. The oak door stood open to let in sunshine and whatever breeze there was. Thick stone walls kept the inside as cool as a cellar. I preferred the smell of hay and horses to the death stench of the hospital. It was a relief to be around people who had the strength to sit up and didn't cry out in pain. Grandfather looked in on me several times a day. I think he was uncomfortable being around the sick. Mrs. Flagg filled me in on his activities. He helped to organize the delivery of food and the burning of filthy mattresses and rags. He sat in on the committee meetings where decisions were made about raising money and caring for the sick. He had pitched a tent in the yard and told me stories about watching the stars at night. I think he secretly enjoyed the commotion. It reminded him of the war again, and it gave him something to do. I would gladly have joined him, but I was too tired. I spent several days eating mutton that tasted like sawdust, picking bugs off my blanket, and sleeping. I did not have any more nightmares, but I always woke confused, thinking I was surrounded by people I knew, instead of sick strangers. Once I thought I was Nathaniel, but it was another nameless orderly. I wondered if I was being haunted by ghosts. Hold, please. I'm going to pause the... Oh, it's so loud. Is that better? Okay. So, she's starting to feel better. She's in the barn. Grandpa's seeming to have a good time taking care of her there and hanging out with the nurse. So now she's kind of wondering about some of the people that she hasn't seen in a while. She says, how has Nathaniel fared? And Nathaniel we know is... Who's Nathaniel? The boy that she has a crush on him. What does he do for a job? He is a painter, you're right. Was he laying in a sickbed thinking of me? Doubtful. He was probably painting flowers for one of Master Peel's daughters who watched him with stupid cow eyes. I couldn't remember where I'd put his painting before we left home. Had I shown it to Mother? What if she found it? Would she burn it? Because does Mom like Nathaniel? No. She's like, you can do better, Matilda. Thinking of Mother made me twist and turn restlessly. She had not responded to the letters Grandfather sent to the Ludingtons. I could see her ordering the Ludingtons' pigs to march in a straight line or replanting their cornfields in orderly rows. If I had recovered from the fever, surely she was on her feet again. Unless. I couldn't think of that possibility. But why hadn't she written? Maybe she was glad to be rid of me for a while. Eliza would miss me, but I had no idea how to find her. Some thought that black-skinned people couldn't get yellow fever, but I had seen 2 sick people in the hospital. Eliza lived close to the river where the disease started. Who would take care of her if she were sick? Every day I felt stronger and had more questions, page 110. By the 6th morning, I felt ready to explode with frustration. I left my bed for the first time and walked to the necessary without assistance. This was a sweet victory. After lunch, I was visited by Mrs. Flagg and a frowning clerk with a spotted face who carried an account book, an ink pot, and a quill. So an ink pot and a quill, that's how they write. It was like a pen. "We have not been able to contact your mother, Miss," said the man as he squinted to read the writing on the page. "Miss Cook. Miss Cook," he scribbled on the page. "You are well enough to leave. It would be immoral to turn a child out into the street, so you will be taken to an orphan house." "No, I'm not an orphan." He raised an eyebrow. "Where is your father?" "He died years ago." "Your mother was ill, according to Mrs. Flagg, but you do not know her whereabouts." "She was sick, but I'm sure she's better now. She's at home, the Cook Coffee House. If you will just send me there." "Other relatives?" Mrs. Flagg interrupted. "Mattie is the granddaughter of Captain William, the gentleman who had been such a help in the kitchen. I'll fetch him now. He has been waiting for the doctor to release her." The clerk did not look pleased that I had a living relative. His heart was set on sending me to the orphan house, I could tell. His pen scratched along the page. He blew on it to dry the ink, then closed the book and folded his glasses. He opened his mouth once to say something, but closed it again. He looked like a toad. Mrs. Flagg returned with Grandfather in tow. His face was bright red and his shirt was stained, but I thought he looked as handsome as ever. "What's this I hear about you being ready to go back into battle?" Grandfather asked. The toady clerk answered for me. "Patients who have recovered enough to walk on their own must be discharged, sir. Provisions can be made to send this child to the orphan house if you prefer." I squeaked in protest. "I'm not a child." "She can stay in the orphan house until her mother is found, if she's found," the clerk amended. "She would be cared for quite well, sir, I can assure you of that. Life will be difficult for all of us until these dark times are over. The orphan house may be the safest place for her." Grandfather puffed up his chest and crossed his arm. "No kin of mine is going to an orphan house, not as long as I have breath in my body. Your recommendation is insulting, sir. I served with President Washington himself. I commanded troops that sent redcoats running back across the ocean. And you suggest that I cannot care for this little snippet of a girl? I shall report your imprudence to the president." He's like, "Yeah, right, I got her." The man pinched the top of his nose and wrinkled his brow like this. "If President Washington is displeased, you may encourage him to come here and speak with me directly," the clerk said. "We have too many lost souls wandering the city streets. I wouldn't want to see this girl join them. But you need not listen to me. My work is done. There's a wagon going into the city tomorrow. You may ride along." Ooh, so they have a ride. Back to town. He gave Grandfather the smallest of nods, gathered his supplies, and hopped off. "Foolish, meddling nitwit," grumbled Grandfather. He would have said more, but just then he broke into a fit of coughing. He pulled at his collar and gasped for air. Miss Flagg pushed him down to sit on my bed, and I pounded on his back in alarm. When the fit passed, he sat motionless for a minute, then opened his eyes. "Look at the two of you," he laughed. "What? Did you expect me to expire right there?" When he says, "Did you expect me to expire," do you know what he meant? Yes. "No such luck. I've got a girl to care for, and he lifted Mrs. Flagg's hand to his lips, a lady whom I've promised to take to a ball one day. Mrs. Flagg dissolved into giggles that reminded me of the Ogilvy sisters. All right, let's check chapter 16 and see if we got enough time. It's a long one. Should we get started? Shall we try? What do we say?
Yes.
We've got about 15 minutes. I bet we can do it. All right, 16. Here we go. Everybody in, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, let's do it. September 24th, 1793. Do we think she's going home today? Hope so. Mrs. Flagg blew her nose into her kerchief with a loud honk. So much grief packed into one wagon, she said tearfully. Fear not, brave Mrs. Flagg, said Grandfather. He saluted her. Our deepest thanks for your care and shelter. Please accept my most sincere hopes that we may meet again under healthier circumstances. Mrs. Flagg curtsied deeply. May the Lord keep and preserve all of you. She waved goodbye, and the wagon rolled forward. Soon, Bush Hill faded into the horizon. Grandfather and I were riding along with 5 fever orphans who were being sent to the orphan house. This is page 114. Grandfather rode at the front with the driver, a relatively clean man with neatly combed hair and a smooth face. He quietly whistled a tune, one of Grandfather's favorites. They would be good company for the journey. I sat on the hardest plank in the back next to a woman named Mrs. Bowles. 2 boys huddled together for comfort. They looked like brothers. The other children stared vacantly ahead. One girl looked to be about my age, and her neck was dirty and her dress was torn. I wanted to speak to her, but I couldn't think of what to say. When she saw me looking at her, she turned away. Mrs. Bowles was a straight-backed woman, dressed in Quaker gray. She was older than Mother, with kind eyes and laughter lines that curled around the sides of her mouth. As we drove away from the hospital, she picked up the smallest crying child and sat him in her lap. The child's sobs kept time with the rhythm of the horse hooves on the ground. He wiped his nose on the front of her dress and snuggled closer in her arms. Mrs. Flagg explained that you have been through a great deal, Mrs. Bowles said gently. Yes, ma'am. These are trying times. They seem to bring out the best and the worst in the people around us. We sat in silence, watching as the slate roofs of the houses on the outskirts of the city came into view. Mosquitoes, gnats, and flies followed the wagon, drawn by the smell of the sweating children and horses. How old are you, Matilda? 14, 15 in December. And are you feeling recovered from your illness? Fully recovered? I nodded. My only complaint is that my stomach grumbles all the time. She smiled and shifted the child in her arms. It's quite normal for someone your age. If I may inquire, she began delicately. That means, can I ask you a couple questions? Matilda says, yes. And the woman says, have you considered what you might do to help? You have recovered, so you cannot get the fever again. You are young and strong. We have a real need for you. How can I help anyone? I'm just a girl. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, I wanted to pinch myself. First time anyone treats me like a woman, and I respond like an infant. You are much more than a girl. Let me assure you of that. You are older than Susanna here. She inclined her head toward the girl with the dirty neck. She has lost her family, but we are not taking her in as an orphan. She will help us with the younger children. The child in Miss Bowles' lap stirred and whimpered. Shh, hush, she whispered to the little one. I know you have not received any word from your mother yet. It may be better for you to stay with us. 116, we would keep you fed and warm, and you could provide us with a much-needed pair of extra hands. The wagon had reached the part of the city where the new houses and businesses were under construction. Where there should have been an army of carpenters, masons, glaziers, plasterers, and painters, I only saw empty shells of buildings, already falling into disrepair, after a few weeks of neglect. Okay, so remember what we talked about, and we kind of experienced this a little bit, that when coronavirus was new to us, what happened to a lot of businesses and places we visited? Well, they closed down for a little bit, right? People were encouraged to stay home. If you didn't feel well, you needed to stay home. So we did a lot of work from home. We didn't go to school, right? So the same thing is happening here in Philadelphia during this time. So Matilda's saying that as they got into town, she's like, you could tell that some of these businesses hadn't been running for a little while because they started to look like they were being neglected. Okay, so where was I? Grandfather would not allow it, so she's responding to the question of, hey, come work with us at the orphanage. And Matilda says, Grandpa would not allow it, I said with confidence. If Mother is still out in the country, then we two shall care for each other. He doesn't know the first thing about shopping at the market or cooking, and I need him to chop wood, and he'll make sure I'm well. It is good that you two have each other, Mrs. Bowles said in the same placid voice, but you should not leave your house once you arrive. The streets of Philadelphia are more dangerous than your darkest nightmare. Fever victims lay in the gutters. Thieves and wild men lurk on every corner. The markets have little food. You can't wander. If you are determined to return to your home with your grandfather, then you must stay there until the fever abates. Grandfather turned to address us. We may end up at the Ludingtons' farm after all, he said. Josiah here tells me there's not much food to be found anywhere, Mattie. I'll write to them again as soon as we arrive home. So everyone they're talking to in this carriage is like, listen, you don't want to be here. There's nothing to eat. The streets are dangerous. So Grandpa's like, we might have to go that farm after all. And does Matilda want to go there? Nope. Won't do you no good, the driver interrupted. The post office just closed down. It could take until Christmas before they can deliver letters. Mrs. Bowles patted my arm. Don't fret, Matilda. If you'd like, you may choose to take employment at the orphanage. I'm sure the trustees would approve a small wage if you helped with the cleaning or mending or minding of the children. They have for Susanna, and she'll help with the laundry. Susanna didn't look strong enough to wash a teaspoon, much less fill a tub of clothing. What will happen to her when the fever is over? I whispered. Mrs. Bowles lowered her voice. She is at a difficult age. She's too old to be treated as a child, but not old enough to be released on her own. Her parents owned a small house. The trustees will sell that and use the money for her dowry. We will hire her out to work as a servant or a maid. She's attractive enough. I'm sure she'll find a husband. A fly bit the ear of a child in Mrs. Bowles' lap, and his howl cut off the conversation. Scullery maid, that was one thing I could never be. I imagined Mother's face when she arrived home and found what a splendid job I had done running the coffee house. I could just picture it. I would be seeing the last customers out the door when Mother would come up the steps, and she would exclaim how clean and how well run the coffee house was. Grandfather would point out the fancy dry goods store I was building next door. I would blush, looking quite attractive in my new dress, French, of course. Perhaps I could hire Susanna to do the washing up. That would be a way of helping. So she's like, I'm not going to work at the orphanage. Mom's gone right now, but she's going to come back to the coffee shop and she's going to see that I ran it all by myself and I'm so successful. She has big dreams for this family coffee shop. I broke off my daydream to take in our surroundings. Grandfather and the driver stopped swapping stories. He turned to look back at me anxiously. We were in the center of a dying city. It was a night in the middle of the day. Heat from the brick houses filled the street like a baked oven. Clouds shielded the sun. Colors were overshot with gray. No one was about. Businesses were closed and houses shuttered. I could hear a woman weeping. Some houses were barred against intruders. Yellow rags fluttered from railings and door knockers. Pus yellow, fear yellow, to mark the homes of the sick and the dying. I caught sight of a few men walking, but they fled down alleys at the sound of a wagon. What's that? I asked, pointing to something on the marble steps of a three-story house. Don't look, Matilda, said Grandfather. Turn your head and say a prayer. I looked, and it appeared to be a bundle of bed linens that had been cast out of an upper window. Then I saw a leg and an arm. It's a man. Stop the wagon. We must help him. He's past helping, miss, the driver said as he urged on the horses. I checked on him on the way out to fetch you this morning. You were too far gone to go to the hospital. His family tossed him out so they wouldn't catch the fever. The death cart will get him soon for burying. Oh, my goodness. Couldn't help but stare as the wagon rolled by the stoop. He looked about 17 and wore well-tailored clothes stained with the effects of the fever. Only his polished boots remained clean. His yellow eyes stared lifelessly at the clouds and flies collected in his open mouth. Won't there be a burial at church service? I asked the driver as he turned east onto Walnut Street. Sorry, motion lights. Most preachers are too sick or too exhausted to rise from their beds. A few stay in the square during the day. That takes care of the praying. How could the city have changed so much? Yellow fever was wrestling the life out of Philadelphia, infecting the cobblestones, the trees, the nature of the people. Was I living through another nightmare? What date is this? I asked Mrs. Bowles. Today is September the 24th, she answered. 24th? That's not possible. I counted on my fingers. We fled on the 8th. When we left, there were reports of 1,000 dead. Do you know what the total is now? It's double that at least, she said. It slowed down those few cool days, but as soon as the temperature rose again, so did the number of corpses. The driver pulled on his reins to stop the horses. The road was blocked by a line of slow-moving cars, each pushed by a man with a rag tied over his face, each holding a corpse. The potter's field is ahead, Mrs. Bowles said as she pointed to the front of the line. That's where they're burying most of the dead. The preachers say a prayer, and then someone throws a layer of dirt on top. Along one side of the square stretched a long row of mounded earth. The grave diggers had dug trenches as deeply as they could, then planted layer after layer of fever victims. Some of the dead were decently sewn into the winding sheets, but most were buried in the clothes that they died in. A field plowed by the devil, I murmured. They're not even using coffins. Haven't seen a coffin for 4 or 5 days now, the driver answered. He flicked the reins and urged the horses on. At 5th Street, the wagon stopped. Here's the orphan house, said Mrs. Bowles. We've taken over the home of William Ralston, although we'll soon need more room. It was an ordinary-looking house, more expensive than some, but typical of Philadelphia. Brick front, windows trimmed in white paint, metal railings, and thick oaken door. The driver helped down Mrs. Bowles and Susanna and each of the children. Mrs. Bowles put Susanna in charge of shepherding 3 of the children inside and stayed to wave goodbye. The driver climbed back into his seat, then flicked the reins of the horses' backs. Remember what I said, Matilda, she called. Take care. Whatever you do, take care. All right, that was 2 chapters down. We have 3 minutes left in class. I hope you enjoyed the 2 chapters from Fever to wrap up the day today. Keep up with us. Feel better soon. And we love you.